Thank you. Welcome everybody back to House General and Housing. Today is still Wednesday, the last day of the month, April 30th. We have been taking testimony all day on S-127, which is the analog of our housing bill that came from the Senate and may well be the vehicle by which these two bills move forward. As for people who are new to visiting us, either online or in person, what we've been hearing, this bill is sufficiently complex that various committees have been working on it. One of those committees is House Commerce, and they were charged with developing and working on the tax increment financing aspect of our bill. They sent to us, transmitted to us this morning, draft 5.2 of their work with the idea, it's not a separate bill, but with the idea that we would put it into our bill in some form. So we've been taking testimony on that tax increment finance aspect today. And we have two witnesses lined up for this afternoon so far.
Four.
Excuse me, wait a minute.
2, 3, 4.
I just didn't quite refresh it.
Okay.
We had four witnesses lined up, and the first is Nancy Owens, who's president of Evernorth, which is three states.
Yeah.
Nancy, come up. Nancy, you are new to this committee this year.
Yes, this is my first time at this.
So what we are going to do is introduce ourselves to you.
Thank you.
Would you like to start?
Good afternoon. Claudia Lamont, Loyal Washington District, Morristown, Elmore, Worcester, Woodbury, and a small part of Stowe.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Gross and I represent Windsor One. Hello, I'm Mary Howard and I represent Rutland City District 6. And we met many years ago at that project, Hickory Street.
Hickory Street,
Yes. I'm Debbie Dolgan. I represent St. Johnsbury, Concord, and Kirby.
Hi, Tom Charlton, Athens, Chester, Grafton, and Wyndham.
Thank you.
Joe Parsons, Newbury, Thompson, and Groton.
Leonard Dodge, Essex Town and City of Essex Junction. Hi, Nancy. Ashley Bartley, Fairfax in Georgia.
Howdy and welcome, Mark Mahan, Plainfield, Marshfield, Callis.
You all covered.
Yeah, we do actually cover not only the whole state, but various different geographies and population types in the state. So tell us your name, about Evernorth, and give us your testimony.
Okay, appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Nancy Owens. I'm the president of Evernorth, and I have worked and lived and been part of the affordable housing community in Vermont for 25, almost 30 years. So, projects that harken back a few years are stuff that I've also been involved in. Evernorth is a nonprofit organization, a community development financing intermediary organization that operates in Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire. We just expanded 5 years ago to cover those other two states, but have previously worked entirely in Vermont. And over the course of our 35 years, we have developed in Vermont about 3,500 homes and 135 different affordable housing rental properties. And about 3 times that if we look at Maine, New Hampshire as well. We have 2 primary roles in this kind of environment in the housing world. One is financing, and we raise capital from banks and other investors in order to purchase those housing low-income tax credits that I know you guys have understand a little bit about. And so we raised capital this year. We just closed a multi-investor fund with investors for about $65 million, which about a third of that will get spent in Vermont. And then the other thing is in Vermont, we are a real estate developer and owner. And so we work in partnership with many of the nonprofit organizations that are in your districts, you know, the Down Streets, Twin Pines, Cathedral Square, Champlain Housing Trust, all of those folks will edge, when we are what we call as a co-developer, co-owner of the low-income housing tax credit projects with them. So we not only finance housing, but also own housing as well. So that's a little background on us. And let me just pull my notes back up. So I'm very interested in this bill because infrastructure is a major capital cost for housing, and certainly creating any new source of revenue to support that expense or other capital costs in housing is really important and of interest to us as a developer and financer of affordable housing. And, and certainly collaborating with municipalities is a great way to respond to the housing crisis that we're in. And the purpose of the bill, as stated in that opening section, 1907, is that the housing infrastructure tax increment financing is to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residences for households of low or moderate income. So that's, sounds like a great thing, but I think there's a few places in the bill where I'm not so sure it's going to achieve that purpose. And there's some refinements that could be helpful. And I just want to, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to propose any draft language, but just want to kind of talk about a couple of concepts that arise or got my attention. And I hope that, my testimony just adds to the volume of conversation that you're having and helps, frame or give some different perspective. But one area that's super noticeable to me is that the basis for the calculation of how much subsidy or capital will flow is totally dependent on the tax valuation. And how that works out differently for affordable housing and market rate housing is something that's noteworthy that I want to call to your attention. So, affordable housing generally, or not even generally, in Vermont, affordable housing is going to be assessed at a lower rate, lower valuation than a similar market rate property, because of the way that our assessors and the state has ruled how property is assessed. And then also think about, property that might be modest housing. Let's say you think about home ownership property, a 1,500 square foot house is going to be assessed at less than a 5,000 square foot house, right? So that those values. And so in the case where the lower assessed value of two identical multifamily projects, one market, one affordable, it would mean that the affordable housing project would qualify for less TIP funding than the market rate project. So, and we know, of course, the infrastructure costs are identical. We're not paying more for a 4-inch sewer line or a stormwater pond at an affordable project than we are for a market rate project. So there's some inequity there about like why is one accruing more?
I just want to, I want to get you to clarify a little for the community. When you say that a less valuable low and moderate income project would qualify for less, I'm assuming you mean that it would, that when a bond is issued to support the infrastructure, the bond is dependent on the amount of tax increment which would be generated, and that tax increment for a affordable project would be lower, so that the infrastructure, the amount of the bond would have to be lower because the payments would be less, so it would support only a lower bond.
Yes.
And that in turn means less money, but the infrastructure is
It's no different.
no different. Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
So I do have an example because I was like, I want to clarify that for myself as well. So last night I'm like going to the, I went to the Winooski Grand List. And there's been a lot of new construction in Winooski in recent years, and there's a couple of projects, both affordable and market rate. And so I looked, and there's one property, right in downtown. It's 45 units of affordable housing with ground floor commercial. And just across the street is 30 units of market rate housing, also with commercial. And the Grand List notes, oh, this is affordable. It's been assessed differently. And so when I did the math and corrected for the number of units, right, for 45 versus 30, but just did a per unit kind of calculation, the tax due on the 30 units would be about $80,000. The tax due on the market, so the affordable might owe $80,000 in tax. The market would owe about $117,000 in tax because they're assessed differently. So then you go through and take the increment, right, at 70%, and then you look at, well, if you had that full 70%, how much borrowing could you do, and so forth. And so what I see is that, the affordable housing in that example in Winooski, using those properties, they would receive, 56,000 of increment per year, and the market rate housing would get basically 50% more. They get 82,000 of increment per year. And then that borrowing, of course, the affordable housing could borrow about $650,000. The market rate of the same property would borrow $950,000. So that's just some basic, I don't know how much anybody has done this kind of calculation, but that's where my mind goes, because that's part of my job is to think about the financing. So because the value of the market rate housing is higher, so more tax is owed, then the greater subsidies available. And so the program as designed is kind of, it favors properties with higher taxes.
Yes.
Can I ask, is there? So this would certainly affect areas where you need additional infrastructure before you can put a house. Is it not wise just policy wise, is it not maybe productive to go to this approach of, how else are we gonna pay for the infrastructure? How, like, the affordable housing folks aren't necessarily gonna be able to do it.
Right.
So if they are not the first ones in, but the very next thing that can go in would be affordable housing that doesn't have to pay for the infrastructure that was needed to set up. Or are you thinking of this beyond just the sort of water, sewer, like other types of infrastructure? Are you concerned that you won't be able to build the affordable housing because there's other types of infrastructure that you're missing?
I
That you
think you're
can
being
settle?
asked, what would you do about the problem that you have out?
Yes. I have a few thoughts, and infrastructure and public, subsidy towards infrastructure is a positive thing for housing and for communities, I think, especially when we have it focused in the areas where we want to build. And we have this long tradition in Vermont of, focusing our development in our towns and villages and where infrastructure is, and yet, infrastructure needs to constantly be improved and so forth. So I think an investment in infrastructure is a positive thing. I want, as an affordable housing developer advocate and as an interested citizen around public policy, I want that public subsidy to benefit affordable housing to the maximum extent. And right now, it's actually, up to a lower extent. So I want to raise that. But I have a couple of other thoughts, and let me just pursue them a little further, and happy to take more questions. But so the other thing, so there's the valuation question, which I think raises some concerns. The other is,
I'm sorry, can I ask a question about the valuation? And Polly Major had brought this up earlier in the morning about, one would assume that there's more of an incentive for higher valued properties, which makes sense. I mean, economically, it makes sense, but in affordable housing, it usually allows for more density, which would then be more units, which would then be more taxes. Like what would you say to that argument that, like, yes, there's an incentive that we want higher value properties. But there's also the reality that there's more density in affordable housing. So instead of having one unit, you might have three.
Multifamily housing overall, of course, is going to be more dense than single family, and my testimony is focused on the multifamily rental environment. I would say, while there is legislative grounding, like in our zoning statutes, for creating some affordable housing density, it's very rarely benefits the property. So we again and again, as a developer of affordable housing, I can report to you that the maximum density is rarely achieved.
In other words, you don't think it's a practical matter that there is actually in Vermont much difference in density?
No, not, it's multifamily housing is multifamily housing. The density,
Even if there are incentives, they don't produce denser.
generally not.
Much of the state, there are no incentives.
I-
The Home Act was just.
No, I understand that. I guess my comment is if you're paying taxes on 3 units versus 1, what's the difference in valuation there?
Certainly, there would be a difference in valuation on 3 units versus 1, which is partly my illustration was meant to equalize, was to say if we have 2 identical buildings, the affordable housing will have a lower valuation. 30 units of affordable housing will have a lower valuation and therefore have a less ability to borrow money.
Is the lower valuation due to the income-based approach? to
Yes.
assess? You might want to explain that.
Well.
In other words, everybody, when an assessor goes around assessing value, they have to have some basis for doing it. And they often use an income-based approach where they'll say, how much income does this project generate? And you can then use a multiplier to get from what its annual income is to its capital value. And they just create capital value rather than, a low income unit generates less income. So theoretically, someone would pay less for it. Its capital value is less. It's because it's always what would the market pay for these units, and since they don't generate as much, the cost is depressed. Yes.
But on that specific land use that has 3 rather than 1, couldn't it equal as far as?
Well, at least what Nancy is testifying to is that whether it's low income, yes, 3 would be a lot more value than 1. But then in terms of low income or low and moderate income versus regular, there's no density difference. People don't build higher density, low and moderate income than they do market rate. So in her example, you have 2 buildings in Winooski of approximately the same density. It's just one is market rate units and one is low income housing units. Yes, Joe?
You equalized it for your math there.
Right, because one was 30 units and one was 45.
Which one was 45?
I think let me just look at my notes. That's on a different page. I think the 45 was the affordable housing. The larger one
I
was.
think that'll go to the point you're trying to make of density, right?
Yeah.
Of like 2 projects, 30, 45, that one's denser. I was trying to understand her
Right.
comment about.
Yeah, I think, you could say say it was a subdivision with 3 single-family homes that were modest $300,000 homes versus a single-family home that was $1 million home, 3 houses, 1 house. I mean, the valuation it fluctuates, right? Based on square footage and other uses. I'm not sure I can comment on your question very accurately, other than to say, in my
But
experience.
you are asserting in your own experience
Yes.
that I'm just repeating this, and please correct me if that's not what you're saying.
Yes.
You're saying that generally speaking, your projects are no more dense than market rate projects in equivalent areas.
That is true. That's my experience.
Can I ask another question? Sorry
Please,
to
go
belabor
ahead.
this. In the Home Act in 2023, and maybe I'm misremembering it, but wasn't there a bonus for density? Like,
Financial bonus or?
You
just
mean a
you
density
get to-
bonus? A density
yeah,
bonus?
there's a density bonus. It was like 40%, right?
For what? I don't recall. I'm sorry, I don't know. That's not,
Okay,
yeah,
never mind.
we can probably pull in someone with more knowledge about that, but I can't answer that question. So my other comment about the program generally is that while, you know, their purpose is stating that it's to benefit low and moderate income households, there's really no mechanism in the bill that assures that the town will use the program for that segment of the population. And I think it's, you know, it would be helpful if there was some way to see some more mechanism. I caught a little bit of Polly Major's testimony. I didn't hear the whole thing, but certainly there's lots of language in other programs that we have, whether it's VHFA or VHCB programs that could be incorporated to provide more definition around what do we mean by moderate and low. And so personally, I would be looking for more definition on that, so that the investments by the state in infrastructure, you know, are creating housing for all Vermonters. And we know the need for housing is substantial for low and moderate income people, and affordable housing, you know, needs financial support to be developed. And we also know that capital resources have been greatly diminished in the last few years, or last year, because of the loss of all the recent ARPA funds. So the crisis is still here. Low and moderate income households need the housing, and this is a new public program which could benefit them. So I want to, as a low income advocate, I want to see this resource benefiting low and moderate income households. And so I would like to see a tightening up of that language so that we know that that will happen. And then I would speak to kind of my experience as a real estate developer and say that overall, I think the program would be enhanced if it were explicitly structured to create mixed income developments. And by mixed income, maybe you know what that term means, but just to say that a portion of it is targeted towards affordable or low or moderate income households, and not all of it is open for the general market to do that. And the closest recent analogy of a state directing and thinking about mixed and incentivizing mixed income projects was the Priority Housing Project rules, which we previously benefited under Act 250. So PHP, Priority Housing Projects, were allowed in certain designated areas of the cities and towns. And if a project had at least 20% of units targeted for affordable, and there was a definition and income and so forth, then that developer would not need to take that project through the Act 250 process. You got a pass. And so we, as affordable housing developers, frequently got that pass because our housing naturally had 20% or more. But what we found and saw over the years that program was in play was that very frequently Evernorth and its local nonprofit partners would be invited to the table at larger developments where there was a master developer with a scheme to develop, 100, 150, 250 units, and they would see the efficacy of working and partnering with us to develop within their master plan our own project that created that 20% of affordability, and then let that whole project, all 250 units or whatever the number was, proceed without an Act 250 permit. That was a high enough value to the master developer that they were willing to forego whatever value they may have gotten by developing the entire project themselves. We also found, and I think the developers that we worked with would say, was that often our development, the affordable housing development was the first project completed in a master plan, which enabled certain parts of the infrastructure to be completed early, like, you know, we might do the stormwater project, or you might link to the water and sewer lines, you know, in advance of getting our affordable housing done, which would then alleviate or, you know, make the rest of the project flow more easily. So, you know,
Nancy, if I
we
could,
did that in St. Albans, South Burlington, White River Junction, Colchester, a bunch of
I could
towns.
ask you, that's really interesting. What I'm hearing you say is that by being the first project, you were able to facilitate infrastructure that facilitated other development.
Often that was part of the,
Why do you think you
sequence
were
of
the
events.
ones that were often first?
well, for that reason and others, yeah, is that we
Because of the exemption of one.
well, the exemption, the timing, I mean, a developer is looking at a whole array of things to how to finance. And sometimes our apportionment of some of the infrastructure would, you know, lay the groundwork literally for the next phase.
But in terms of why you were first, you said that was, you know, is that because of the exemption or because of the external financing that you could bring to bear that maybe was quicker, or?
I think it's a mix of factors that the master developer would undertake on how they finance. But more importantly, I guess I would emphasize is that we were invited to the table, and that affordable housing, that 20% of the total development became affordable because of that PHP designation. And frankly, without the PHP designation, which we no longer have, right? Under the new Act 250, that designation is removed, and any project that's a housing project that's in certain areas can advance. Those invitations aren't going to be forthcoming. There's no need for the developer to work with us.
Nora, did you have a question?
Yes, that was basically my question. So what I'm getting is that we should reinsert that phenomenon that you just described didn't happen with just market forces. It was because it's, okay,
Yes.
thank you.
It didn't, and it won't happen without a structured program and incentive. And this incentive that you're creating is a great incentive, and it could be used to create more affordable housing if it were structured slightly differently. And so I went back to the math. So then I circled back to the math, and I said to myself, if this project, if the new program had a 20% incentive, you know, what would that look like? And back to my, I used a larger project just for simpler math, but if I used the basis of the math in Winooski, like what that financing looked like, and I said, okay, if we had 200 homes that were being built under a new master permit, the math would work out that they could generate about $6.3 million to cover infrastructure costs for 200 homes. I have to get more feedback from my team, but I think, you know, that's going to cover a huge amount of infrastructure, right? A big portion, maybe all of it. So if 20% of those homes were affordable and valued at that lower rate, right, which means that it would generate a little less tax increment and a little less borrowing capacity, what would that look like? What would the financing look like? And so if 20% of those homes were affordable and valued at the lower rate, the financing would drop about $400,000. The developer would still have access to $5.9 million under those terms. It's still a substantial benefit to any development at that kind of scale. But it wouldn't happen. The developer wouldn't make the choice to put 20% of the units affordable. They're not going to. Why would they do that, right? So if you can set a frame like the PHP that we know worked, and in these larger developments, I think the financial benefit that accrues to the project because of this program would be substantial enough that it wouldn't harm the outcome that you're looking for, which is more housing for everybody.
Go ahead and when you,
Do you know how many PHPs are in the current 8 TIF districts?
No, I don't know. I mean, I think probably the Natural Resource Board folks know because they have to issue a permit that's not a permit. They have to issue a ruling, like you go to the board, right, the regional board and say, I qualify, and they give you back a document that says, yes, you do. So there must be a number somewhere.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know that we've used it repeatedly, probably more than a dozen or 15 times
In the districts.
in the districts. Or the downtown, the downtown designated areas.
Yeah, so when we were just talking about the much smaller communities, much more rural communities, and having maybe a carve out of like just like a number of units being built, does that would not require the 20% or whatever number we land on. I mean, we could say 35% or, whatever percentage, but if we make a carve out for a smaller number of units, do you have any thoughts on that? Like number of maximum units that you could build without that 20% requirement? Or any
Yeah.
other thoughts on that?
I think there's some examples around the state, like I know, I don't know if I'll have this accurately, but I believe Burlington, which has an inclusionary zoning rules, which are similar, right, where they're saying in the certain zones, 20% has to be affordable or 25% has to be affordable. I believe they have an exemption that's around 10 units. But there might be other examples like that where communities have already established a kind of norm for smaller developments. Yeah, which makes sense too. I just think the process of procuring a bond, getting a town vote. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how this CHIP process will unfurl. A developer is going to want to generate enough increment that the financing that they would secure would be worth going through the effort. So that's something to consider.
So like, is it even likely that somebody would be able to benefit from the CHIP if they're only building a couple of units?
Well, I don't know. I mean, everyone's going to make that own calculation about what that effort is worth.
We're hoping that they will. That's
Yes.
sort of the goal of this, is
Right.
why we're not just making the whole state a TIF. I mean, in
Yeah.
some ways, maybe we're making the whole state a TIF district.
But I think that's a calculation that any developer will make, and I would look to those smaller developers to answer that question. Or people who are looking at smaller developments, rather. Yeah.
any other questions? Nancy, does that conclude your testimony?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I appreciate that. I just, the last thing I might just conclude with is, I've worked with a lot of employers around the region in Vermont and in Maine and New Hampshire. And while, there's the low and moderate income target of folks who are in that 80% range, 80 to 100% range, are folks who are working and who are employed in businesses all across the region. And in my conversations with employers, that's one of the most challenging groups because they're often, because of the high cost of housing that's close to jobs, they're forced further and further away, and that impacts their ability to hire people because they're driving further, their childcare sources are further away, all those things. So I know that's a big voice in our community right now about employment and job retention and job creation. And I just would remind the committee that it's also the folks who are earning in that kind of $18 to $30 an hour range who would benefit from this program if we can hone in on and make a portion of the resources really clearly tied to that low and moderate income target. So that's what I have to offer, and I really appreciate and hope that testimony adds to your debate and conversation. And
Any final questions? Nancy, thank you so much for taking the time to come down.
Happy to do that. Yeah.
Really, thanks a lot.
Thank you for your work on, appreciate it. Molly, you're.
Our, our next witness is Julie Hans, who is the town manager of Town of Chester, which is happens to be one of the one of our representatives here on the committee represents the town of Chester. Julie, I don't know that you were here when we introduced ourselves before, were you?
No, I was not.
Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we just go around quickly and introduce ourselves? Can you, the best we can with your seeing us with our little camera here.
Good morning or afternoon. I'm Ashley Bartley. I serve Fairfax in Georgia.
Hi, I'm Leonora. I serve Essex Town in the city of Essex Junction.
Joe Parsons, Newberry, Topsom, and Groton.
I'm Tom Charlton and I represent the epic borderlands between Windsor and Windham County.
Epic Borderlands, wow,
Best one yet?
yeah.
I'm Debbie Dolgan. I represent St. Johnsbury, Concord, and Kirby.
Gail Pezzo, Chittenden 20, Colchester.
I'm Mary Howard. I represent Rutland City District 6.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burrows and I represent Windsor 1, which is Heartland, West Windsor and Windsor.
And thank you for.
Yeah.
I know, it's happening. Good afternoon. Sorry, Loyal Washington District.
And I'm Mark Mahali, and I represent Calais, Plainfield, and Marshfield. And welcome. So, Julie, you want to introduce yourself to us? We're reviewing the tax increment financing aspects of the housing bill. And happy to hear from you.
Thank you so much, and it's lovely to meet all of you. As I was introduced, my name is Julie. I'm the town manager down in Chester. Chester is a town of about 3,200 people down in Windsor County. And this bill would have a significant impact for a municipality like Chester and Chester specifically. So I was asked to share a little bit about a project that we have going on down here. Chester received a municipal planning grant last year to complete a housing feasibility study on a 139-acre parcel of town-owned land. And we're finding through that study that this land is very promising for a potential development of approximately 60 to 80 homes, primarily multifamily, townhouse type structure, although those details would be worked out, but roughly 60 to 80 homes is what this would house. So some key points about it, that the land is town-owned. The land is located across from the town's municipal sewer system. The existing water and wastewater infrastructure is at the access road that would go up to this development. And the town is currently working with our regional planning commission to make sure that this property is located in the required tier 1 area, so that we can comply with all of those requirements. We are finding through our process that the town is receiving really broad community support for this project. And most of our questions are coming in around financing and how does Chester get a project like this up and running and making it a reality. And of course, this is where that CHIP program would come in and would be imperative for towns our size. Another barrier that we have experienced, or I am anticipating we will experience, is that while my 20 years of being here in Chester, I have extensive experience in managing very large projects for the town to include a lot of federal grants. This type of a project requires a different level of specialty. So small towns like Chester don't have engineers and architects and attorneys on staff. So this bill, allowing a portion of the municipal portion to be used for technical assistance is, I think, extremely important for towns our size to be able to get a project like this going. So that element of the bill for us would be really important. The other thing that we've identified, or that we feel we've identified, is that the housing conversation, I think a lot of times gets focused around the larger areas and around the larger cities, naturally. And I think that small towns in Vermont are going to play a really vital role and have a lot to contribute in meeting the housing needs in our state. And this bill is a game changer for towns like Chester who have land and have the ability, just need that extra tool to help us accomplish those. And I know that I've spoken with many counterparts, my counterparts in other towns who have similar projects, but they're finding the same barrier. We just simply lack the tools. You know, a full TIF is not something that would apply for a town of Chester. It's just not something that is an appropriate tool for a town our size. So these, this type of program could make a lot of these projects achievable. And I don't know, I just feel like these projects across smaller towns, many of them, I mean, I think it's a win for towns. I think it's a win for the state. You know, developed housing, increased grand list, and, you know, future contributions to the ed fund and jobs and schools, and everything grows. And I think it's just a win, but it is a tool that smaller towns really need access to. So I'm just here hoping and asking, you know, and asking for you to support the bill. And I think that a lot could get accomplished through the state of Vermont by giving smaller communities these tools.
Question, yes.
Not a question, just a comment. Thank you so much, Julie, for being here today. And your testimony, I think, is why we're doing this. I'm so excited to see what happens in Chester and to see how that project ends up. And please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, or I'll tell everybody on the committee that we should go take a field trip. But this is the stuff that makes me really excited, and I'm just happy to hear your testimony. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Other questions of the committee, by the committee? I have a question or two. This is really interesting. So first of all, how did it happen that you happen to own the 139 acres of the town that owns it?
Sure.
You want
Yeah.
any farms?
So back in 2016, the town acquired that parcel of land and carved out well, it was more acreage. It was more than 139 acres at that time. It was 150 something, and we carved out about 20 acres for our secondary backup redundant water tank. We needed that property because of the elevation. It needed to be at the same elevation as our existing water tank for pressurization and all of those things that I can't really talk about. So we ended up acquiring this entire parcel. And the town has been sitting on it since that time, thinking about what types of projects would fit there. I think for a while, I've had in my mind, boy, this would be a great housing site down the road for somebody. You know, and then COVID hit, and with all that came, you know, after that kind of came the housing crunch. And so it's just something we decided to look at to say maybe that is a great use of the rest of that property.
Did I understand that you need infrastructure help because there is infrastructure nearby, but then it would have to come up the access road and get to the development?
Correct. Correct.
Also, you mentioned, is it not in tier 1 now, but you're getting it in tier 1, or?
Yeah, the Regional Planning Commission is right on the edge. So the Regional Planning Commission is working with us to get it through that process so that it is in a tier 1 location. There's not going to be a problem. We just have to go through that process.
Right. Any other, Tom? You look like you have something to say.
Do I look like that? It's common. So I'm wondering, actually, one of the things that you brought up a few times, Mark, whether the tax abatement or some of the other tools that might be helpful, either for a town our size or for even smaller towns, Mark. You might be able to explain the question better.
Well, this is one of the issues that Commerce is working on, but they hadn't quite come to the point where they had a good draft yet. And that's instead of, and it's the tax increment financing just means that you estimate what's the land going to be worth when you're done with the development?
Mhm.
What's it worth now?
Mhm.
Then you figure out what's the property taxes that it's generating now. Well, near nothing because the town owns it in this case. What's it going to be worth when it's sold and it's got houses on it? And you take that difference. What's it going to generate every year in taxes? And you know that's the amount that will be the maximum amount that you could devote to paying off bonds. And that can tell you how big your bond issue is. So that's tax income. The other way to do it, another way is what's called tax stabilization. And you just say, the town would say to a developer, you just get a pass on property taxes for 5 years or 10 years. You're just not going to pay property taxes.
Mhm.
And that money, then when the developer figures, how much am I going to charge for these houses? How much am I going to charge for rent? The developer just figures that in and hopefully can charge less.
Mhm.
And it's simpler. I mean, the problem is we're not there yet. It's something that Chair Marcotte said he'd like to work on through the summer and then have it ready for next session. But it's conceivable. There's another member of our committee that has been pestering him sufficiently hard that we might even try to get it sooner.
Twice a week.
Okay, is tax abatement something, or tax stabilization, is that something that would be of benefit to our 3,200 person town or some of the smaller ones like under 1,000? Do you think they would find that useful?
Yes.
Yeah, we have, Tom, we
You're
did,
asking her.
are you asking me? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, okay, sorry. Tom, we did, when Putney Palster was in town forever ago, the taxpayers had voted on tax stabilization for them. It's the only one that I'm aware of we've ever done, but yes, it would be another great tool of drawing business to the community.
You couldn't do both. You have one or the other.
One or the other, right?
Yes.
On the tax stabilization though, so would that then give you the ability to, because my understanding on the increment financing is you can basically borrow against that future investment. So does that work the same way with tax stabilization?
I think you're above my pay grade.
Okay.
I think that.
And I know
it's
just
hard.
enough
I
about-
think it's hard. It wouldn't be bonds issued by the town.
Right.
There's no income it's just saving the developer money.
Yeah, it might affect what the
The
developer.
developer might be able to issue bonds that they would have that extra money to use in the development in all kinds of ways.
Understood.
I mean, you already have the ability to help the project by writing down the price of the land.
Mhm.
I mean, theoretically, you could sell the land for fair market value.
Mhm.
But you can help the development by writing down the price that you sell or by delaying your payments until the development starts to really pay off.
Yes.
That's only the municipal portion.
By what?
But currently, that's only with the municipal portion.
Yeah. Any other questions by members of the committee? Julie, thank you so much for appearing.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to sell Chester a little bit and what we've got going on.
Great. And apparently, I don't know, you might see more of this.
Wonderful. I welcome it.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Our next witness is Samantha Sheehan, who is, I thought was here.
I'm sharing.
She's sharing. And she's up, but you're up there too. It's that's because you're sharing your.
Yeah.
You're sharing
Already
your screen.
in the system.
And Josh is gonna come. Do you, you can have the big chair
I
today.
don't know, sure.
Used to the metal chair.
I don't know.
I was calmer, so it was a joke. It was back.
Hoping that you would say, nah, you're taking.
I do this, it's just like, 10 minutes of my day where I can be taller than Josh.
Well, I don't know. I never see him here without you.
Okay.
So you guys are testifying kind of together.
Yeah,
Okay.
always.
So you want to both introduce yourself?
For the record, Josh Hanford, Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
And for the record, I am Samantha Sheehan, also with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns.
And as Samantha pulls up the PowerPoint, just sort of setting the stage here that this CHIP, project-based TIF, financing tool to help municipalities build infrastructure to support housing has been a top priority of the league and our members for a long time. It was voted on sort of in a refined capacity just this past October. It's literally the #1 priority. We've been very involved in this bill since the beginning, multiple committees, supporting it, trying to refine it, trying to express the needs of our members. And thank Julie for joining us and giving us an example of her great project down in Chester and how it would support their efforts to build the housing that they plan for, that they envision, that they desire. And I think just a reminder back to that this is a financing tool for infrastructure. This is not a direct subsidy for housing construction. This is not a direct subsidy program to achieve X affordability or X additional standard. Those are all goals. Those are all certain envisioned goals that municipalities have that we need in the state. But just a reminder back to what this pays for, the infrastructure that the municipality will ultimately own, and that municipalities typically own infrastructure for the benefit of the public at large, all public at large. And we've been consistent that we support a program that is sort of housing type agnostic, that is flexible, that is simple, that is something that select board members across the state can understand, can enter a development agreement that they feel comfortable with, and that will seek to support this housing. And so I think, what we're here to just talk about a couple points in the bill. Again, we're very supportive of the bill. We want this to be successful. We really do. We're just highlighting a couple areas that give us some pause that may not have that intended success in all communities across the state. And so, the first area we want to talk about is the primary residence condition. There's no hesitation that this is a goal of every municipality in Vermont that wants to see more moderate priced and affordable housing built for primary residents. That's not in question. What's in question is this tool in the CHIP program, or this requirement in the CHIP program that requires a municipality to certify this in a development agreement, when we have not heard how a municipality would be able to enforce this. And that gives us pause as some examples of, well, we could just claw back the money. What money? I mean, this tax increment paid for the infrastructure that the municipality now owns. Who are they clawing back the money from if there's non-compliance? Who are the folks at the municipal level that are reviewing housing subsidy covenants that they may have with someone else? And so we're not sure how we could enforce this. And so that gives us pause when our municipal attorneys say, not sure we're going to advise you, select board, to sign an agreement that has this as a condition. And we don't want that to be the case. We want this to be successful. We want them not to pause around this condition and are, seeking to find another way to do this. And to be clear, we have come in your committee. You've been very receptive of our desire to regulate the proliferation of short-term rentals. We don't have the full authority and authorization to do that in municipalities. You put in your housing bill a way for us to add an additional surcharge or tax on short-term rentals so the communities that are most affected could put that back into mitigating those impacts in their community, supporting a housing trust fund, supporting a down payment assistance, doing the things that actually help mitigate the impacts. This doesn't do that, and we don't have those authorizations. And so this is a goal that we share, but don't feel like we can actually influence or make happen. And no one's answered the question about how we are to enforce this, who's to bring an action forward. 10 years down the road, something changes. Is it a citizen that's complaining that's not being used by a full-time resident? What position does that put the select board in to call and question the terms of the development agreement? And so it's unanswered for us. And we want this to work. We don't want to give select boards pause when they see this in the development agreement.
Okay, before we go, well, did you want to comment on this? Or you
Yeah.
want to go on to, okay, go ahead.
Or do you have a question?
Well, I want you to, as to the point that Josh is just raising, which is, as I understand it, you're worried that there may be no effective enforcement. And you also don't know that towns have the capability of that enforcement. Were you gonna, I don't want, before you moved on, I wanted to see if there.
I'll say more about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if anyone has, the Commerce Committee's amendment available, I can screen share after we discuss as well, if that's helpful. But we're specifically discussing one sentence in section 1909.
Which is on.
Page 6, yeah, if I remember. Line 12. Line 12, section 4. Thank you. So section 4 is exactly, section 4 of subsection 1909 is our issue here. The subsection is the Housing Infrastructure Agreement subsection. In the design of the CHIP program, the municipality must enter into what the statute will call the Housing Infrastructure Agreement. This is essentially a development agreement or a contract between the municipal corporation and the developer of the CHIP site. The CHIP program, if passed and realized, does not invent the concept of a development agreement, but it does require one. Development agreements exist in almost every case where there's a public-private partnership for development, whether that's the development of a business park, the development of a affordable housing project, the development of a mobile home park. If the municipality has an obligation to fulfill for the success of the project, it will have a development agreement with the developer, which ideally protects both parties. Our purpose, we are the LCT, we speak for town officials across Vermont, is that the development agreement be an effective contract to protect the municipal interest. And by protecting the municipal interest, we protect the interests of Vermont taxpayers and water ratepayers and sewer ratepayers who are your constituents as well, of course. So beyond the criteria in this amendment or in S-127 that would be required to be included in this infrastructure agreement, there would be lots of other stuff that both the developer cares about obligating and that the municipality cares about obligating. For example, the timeline for each party to secure a permit that's needed. So if the municipality needs to acquire a stormwater permit, they may be obligated to do that in a certain timeline, vice versa for the required building permits. The timeline to start and end construction. There have been some famous lawsuits by Vermont municipalities over the lack of construction on a project. Those lawsuits happened because of a strong development agreement. Phases of construction. So if it's a project that is intended to be built over many years, but the public improvements will happen in the early years, that will be really important to lay out. There's other examples, I'm sure you could come up with your own. This is just to illustrate sort of the importance of this document. It's really important that it be an effective contract that the municipal officials who are party to it are uninhibited to enforce. right? Like if things go sideways, if the development isn't happening, if the money and the financing isn't coming through, if there is some pending risk to taxpayers in the town, we want the select board to feel uninhibited in acting on the terms of the contract and obligating the developer to do what they signed up for. So I'll pause there. Good, keep going, okay. So what we are asking, and have asked, is for the provision, section 4, to be removed. The development, the housing infrastructure agreement just does not feel like the right home for this state to realize this policy goal of building primary housing as opposed to building short-term or housing that could be used as short-term rentals or second homes. Most municipalities in Vermont do not have the authority by charter or by state law and do not have the resources to enforce this provision. Beyond that, we foresee potentially serious unintended consequences as the program rolls out, including that this could discourage, as Josh said, municipalities that don't have the resources on staff, so they don't have rental regulation ordinance, or they don't have code enforcement who enforce rental ordinance, because they may just say, well, we don't have that department in our city government, so we can't do a chip. So they might just not go for it. This could discourage the use of chip for housing for homeownership, because that gets sort of even more complicated. Like, how do you regulate the perpetual use of land owned by someone through the transfer and sale of that property from one buyer to the next? With rentals, it's maybe a little bit more straightforward, but again, you still need people and staff and ordinance that allows you to make sure it's not a short-term rental. With homeownership, how do you do that? Is there a permanent covenant on the property? Are covenants something we like or believe help build housing? Like, who enforces the covenant if it becomes violated? Typically, that would not be the municipality for other types of covenants that exist. And this could discourage all sorts of developers, I think, especially the ones we really want to help build smaller scale projects in more rural communities, who just may have no intent of having a responsibility for the life of the housing development site. Like, they don't want to be managing, they don't want to be the property manager of an HOA for 20 years, because that's not part of their business model. So they may not take up the opportunity to chip.
And just to add, we're not against housing covenant agreements that ensure affordability or ensure primary residence. That happens now and very successfully, but it usually happens on a subsidy side by someone that's providing the subsidy is monitoring that, is ensuring that, is following with the land records. There are people that are involved in those processes with that subsidy. This isn't coming with a subsidy for the municipality to follow the life of a home ownership for 20 years and the different sales and who's going to be living there and if they're following these rules. And if a resident, comes to the select board and says that housing development used with our tax increment financing, because remember, the municipality is giving up more than the state is on their share of property taxes. There's no cars there 6 months of the year. This obviously isn't a primary residence. You need to do something about it. You're in violation of this agreement. Go after the developer. And so that's what's different. These are perfectly fine policy goals, perfectly fine ways to support affordable housing or permanent residence, but they don't belong in a municipal development agreement. They belong with a subsidy source and an organization that can monitor and enforce that.
Questions by members of the committee on this issue, because I know you're going to go on with others.
Well,
We don't have many, to be
don't-
honest.
So I did bring, since we've last seen you and discussing this committee's housing bill, we have traveled the State House talking about CHIP. So I did sort of assemble like the testimony we have provided in the development of CHIP.
We have,
Yeah, and if you want, we can talk about that. If not,
but I wanted to
yeah,
take it issue by issue, and
Sure.
you have that written down.
okay,
I have to confess, I'm puzzled by your position.
okay.
First of all, well, I think that it's fair, rather than put it on me, to hear your answers to what people are saying. One is that it is a public subsidy. Essentially, the education fund is subsidizing your infrastructure, and we don't want to pay for short-term rentals.
Either do we.
Okay, well, you know, so then it comes to, well, you have a contract and it's enforceable. I can think of lots of ways you could enforce this. You could easily have a fine. Put in a fine. What you're saying, I think, is you don't want to be in the position of enforcing it. You like the idea, you just don't want to enforce it. Who would enforce it then?
Well,
What's your idea on how this would be enforced? If it's, I get the sense you're willing to go to court. The town is willing to, well, we all know that an obligation in a contract without a remedy is useless, okay? Which is why I respect you're saying take it out, because having it in without a remedy is worthless. If someone doesn't build phase 3 of a project, the town sues them, right?
sorry, say that again. If
They don't
someone doesn't
build
build phase 3
3 of a project
it's
and
not
leaves
suitable.
it, leaves phase 2 without some important piece of infrastructure. They don't build the park they're supposed to build. The town can sue them and either get damages, or the contract has remedies in it.
And it's
Why is this any
unlikely-
difference?
Yeah, and it's unlikely the town would sue for damages. The town would sue for the obligation to be fulfilled, right?
Yeah, okay.
So either build the park or cause the park to be built, right? Would
Well,
be
that's
how that
damage,
contract
causing the
works.
park to be built. If they don't do it, it's damages.
Yeah, so, but I want to take your question in parts and first talk about who in the municipality, who in local government enforces it? Because you're saying we could assess a fee. Well, that requires the authority to assess a fee.
Isn't this authority?
I don't know. That's a great question. That's hard to understand. Who are we assessing the fee against? Is it the developer? Is it the HOA? Is it the new owner of the property who was never party to the contract where this is obligated? At what point does it not become a primary residence? Because most municipalities, actually, I'm not aware of any sort of local ordinance built around the concept of primary residence at all. So we have so who are we enforcing this provision against? And at what point? Right? Like, is it at the point at which the Huntington homes on the new street that didn't exist before get sold? Or is it at the point at which that first buyer has a property transfer? Is it, so there's the complexity of enforcement, and then there's the question of who.
Right.
Because if a municipality has a appointed volunteer lister that manages grand list maintenance and sort of receives homestead filings from the state once a year and does their sort of civic volunteer duty as a lister, is it realistic to expect that they'll maintain enforcement of this provision on potentially more than one development site for potentially decades? Yeah.
Can I say out loud what I think you're saying? And then if I'm super off base, please let me know. VLCT supports the intent behind this section,
Absolutely.
but it's the belief that it's not sugared out the way it needs to be. Or there's too many details that are still question marks, and that this is not the bill or the place to move forward with this intent, that a separate bill on either primary residencies, or we tried talking about STRs earlier, as you had said, would be better suited for this type of policy intent.
That, and, there's annual reporting that calls out non-compliance with primary residence. So when that shows up each year by VEPSI, and there's a chance to say, this isn't working. People lied to us, the developer, the homeowners, whoever, there's a way to correct after the fact.
So I just put on the screen subsection 1907. So this is where the CHIP, as drafted, as passed unanimously by the Senate, defines the purpose of the CHIP program. I'll read it. The purpose of housing infrastructure tax increment financing is to provide revenues for improvements and related costs to encourage the development of primary residence for households of low and moderate income. VLCT enthusiastically supports that policy. We agree that CHIP should and is an effective tool for realizing that policy. And we think, apart from subsection 1909, this amendment fulfills that. Because there's a requirement in the municipality's development plan and in their application for VEPSI approval that they demonstrate that the public improvements to be used that are going to use the tax increment will fulfill the purpose of CHIP. And then failing that, so if several things go wrong, like if the municipality has planned poorly in its municipal plan, if the development agreement is insufficient to deliver on that plan, if VEPSI doesn't catch that those things have not happened, or if there is a failure to meet the obligations of the development agreement and the development plan by the developer, then there is the reporting at the end where also, as Josh said, it is required that these elements of number of primary residences, the expected rent or home cost to Vermonters, all of this is reported to the legislature annually by VEPSI through the program. And that's actually not even counting all the other layers of municipal oversight and public process that are required just for municipalities to make decisions to even get us to the VEPSI application, but.
Got a question about this. I
Yeah,
know they want to go
I'm
on.
confused because on the one hand, I'm hearing you say that there's no way for the municipality to provide oversight on who's occupying a residence. And on the other hand, you're saying we'll get that information at the annual report.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that.
And then my second question is just, doesn't this become pretty obvious with if somebody is declaring a home as their homestead or not? Like,
That's one of our questions. Is it?
I think all of your questions that you raised are perfectly valid, and cities around the country have answered them all. There are contractual answers to all those questions. I think it boils down to what you believe Vermont towns should be able to do, not whether they can. There are ways to enforce all of this. It's just a question of whether you think our towns should. And if not, I think it would be really interesting. I would love to hear how you think it should be enforced. That is, who in this state should have that obligation?
We believe that short-term rentals, we believe that policy to regulate short-term rentals should be done at the local level, and that municipalities do not have the existing authorities or tax setting tools to do that, and that it is better done municipality or zoning district wide, not within a singular housing program for a singular housing project in one town. What we have asked already many times throughout the session is for the broad regulatory authority for municipalities to address that problem at the local level, not just in a CHIP development, but in existing housing stock in other future housing stock to be built without a CHIP incentive and on.
Any questions before we move on to their other concerns? Yes, Tom.
So if a municipality already does have zoning in place with regard to short-term rentals, presumably they would have a mechanism for dealing with this.
That's
And,
not always the case. Sorry,
Okay.
there's more.
well, there's a secondary question, a separate one.
So we did survey this question, like what types of regulation do you have or not have for short-term rentals at the local level? My recollection, and we could put this back together for you all, and I can send it. My recollection is there was around a dozen municipalities that did have a short-term rental regulation of some kind. Those regulations, they are like a full rainbow of regulation. So some are as simple as you are required to register, say this is a short-term rental and register to the town, and you are required to have a fire safety inspection. That's like the low end. The high end would be the Burlington ordinance, which is a much more comprehensive type of regulation, and that is enforced by that city's permitting and inspections department that enforces all other types of rental regulation that that city has. And then in between, for example, there are some towns where there are sort of particular wastewater impact concerns because they don't have sewer. And so they have a worry that, okay, this house has a 2-bedroom septic, but we see it listed on Airbnb that it sleeps 12. So they have like fire inspection plus water treatment and wastewater inspection. They may have fees for the purpose of registration, so they can send their zoning administrator out to do that wastewater inspection, things like that. That's kind of like the middle ground.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question, and I'm back in subsection 1909. And thinking of one of the first slides that you shared with the different types of things that should be in the agreement that aren't otherwise articulated here, timelines, and this one, yes. Would not be covered under 5, provide the housing infrastructure agreement shall 5 provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligation of all parties. Is that not what?
Yeah.
All right, so it doesn't
These
include,
are,
so
yeah.
they're required to give thought to this as it's written.
They are required and they are likely to do
Okay.
that
Okay.
without the requirement. And to us, that is like the sort of essential purpose of that contract, right? Is section 5.
Right,
Yeah.
okay. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. Having it here instead of them dealing with it as they find appropriate is a
Sorry,
disincentive?
having section 4.
There's a section 4 is the disincentive.
Section 4, we feel could have unintended consequences with the
That
uptake of.
specific.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
'cause some of the
These
other
were
things we're
examples of
talking
type of
about-
things we would enforce.
Yeah,
And
Okay,
if
yeah,
you were asked to enforce the primary residence, that's what we're questioning, whether we would have the ability to do that in many cases where we might not have the information about who's living there, when they sold it, who was the transfer to. The mechanisms that handle those now are typically with certain subsidy programs that require that. I signed dozens and dozens of housing subsidy agreements for years. I know how that happens. I'm not sure that municipalities are signing housing subsidy covenants to ensure these various things, and who would monitor that, how that would be enforced. That's what we're bringing up. Not that we don't want this to be the end result and the purpose that we agree with. It's that not sure that folks are going to jump to sign up for this and understand how to do it. And after all, the municipality needs to sign this development agreement to take on this program to build the infrastructure to support the housing we want, much of it being affordable.
Yeah.
Joe?
All right, yeah, thank you. Full picture came into view about halfway through this whole conversation and, yeah, it does seem like a bit of an odd. I think a municipal covenant on the deed is, if it's a, private property for the Chester project, I'm sure those are houses that are gonna be built and you buy the house and land, it's a privately owned home at that point. It seems pretty odd to then have a municipal covenant on that land based on the water and sewer pipes that go to it.
Correct.
It just,
There's
just an
plenty
odd way of doing it.
Associations that have covenants of this very thing, and they enforce them themselves.
Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah. On top of that, another one that I don't think we've mentioned is just, the language of it itself. And maybe I'm off base on this, but if you offered it to somebody exclusive, we haven't talked about the homeowner who buys it and then 4 years down the road decides that that'll now be their second home. If it was offered to you exclusively that way, done. That's how they offered it to me. I agree, I bought it with that intent and it's 4 years later and.
Yeah, there are scenarios, we don't want to go into all the
Yeah,
things
it
just
just
thought
seems-
about, if someone moving away for a period to take care of the health and then they sublet the home, it just.
Yeah,
There's a dozen little things that go through people's minds when you start talking about this and who's gonna tell who's not living there and who needs to enforce it. But other than that, the language in the bill, we're supportive of this bill. We're just raising this question that this could be challenging for municipalities to get behind without some unanswered, without, maybe some of these questions could be answered throughout the process.
It's really like the placement of this provision within the housing infrastructure agreement. That's what is raising our concern. It's not the purpose. It's not really the request or obligation or intent of municipalities to regulate the use of housing in this way, which many municipalities are working towards being able to do. It's like requiring the provision in the agreement between the municipality and the developer does not seem, I think you actually said it best, Chair, like, putting an unenforceable provision in a contract is not useful. And that's what we're alerting you to.
I guess I am still puzzled, but let me try to put it this way. Supposing we solve the problem of authority and enforcement with that. In other words, supposing we found a way for municipalities to enforce this in all situations and gave them the authority. Would that be enough?
If it was a eligible use of the increment on the municipal side for the life of the development site or for the life of this sort of regular obligation, then yeah, maybe. I think that would solve a lot of the problems. It still is a complicating layer.
Yeah.
So the program that increases the sort of daily workload of a town that wants to do a CHIP. So it doesn't make that go away, but then it would not be an unfunded mandate. If you paired the sort of ability to use increment and if you paired the regulatory authority to execute it, that would eliminate that part of the concern.
And certainly
Definitely.
there would be municipalities, raise their hand and do it, and we would support them. If it didn't solve the problem for all municipalities that wanted to participate, we would still support something that some municipalities would take advantage of. It's just highlighting that in the current state with unanswered questions and sort of authority and capacity might be a barrier for many.
I have further questions, but I think I'll take them offline.
Yeah.
You want to tell us what else? Did you
Well,
have?
are there other questions? Like I
We
know,
don't- we don't-
like any other questions about CHIP or about this amendment or about how municipalities might use CHIP? I mean, we don't want to take up time or distract you, but.
I do have a question, but Sadia, did you have a question?
I did,
I'm sorry, I
no,
didn't
it's
see.
okay, no, it's okay, it's okay, it was a little raised. I'm just trying to process the concern, but I think it's just, I'm gonna just be stuck in this place. Because I'm confused as to if the purpose is to encourage development of primary residences. And we are saying that there should be provide terms and sufficient remedies to ensure these are being offered. And it can be negotiated through the covenants or contracts. Would that, if we are taking this part out, would that not undermine the initial purpose of it being for primary residences? Like, that's like, so I'm just, I think that's where we're
We can
going.
deal with that in
Yeah,
committee discussion,
right,
but
yeah.
I don't know if you.
The thing I would offer is we suggested for sort of compromise language to leave this in there at the initial offering. Can find ways to do agreements and contracts that whoever's the first person developing this rental property, first person developing this home ownership and purchasing it, can find a way to protect these interests and ensure this happens at the initial offering. That it's the subsequent sales, a cash sale later on, that we don't get any mortgage paper. Like, that's what we're saying. Like, this is 20 years or more. Not sure that those, and then to have to enforce something that now someone lives there that's not supposed to live there, and we're supposed to tell them to leave the home. Like, it just is. But at the initial offering, I'm pretty sure there's contracts and developers and folks that can find out how to make this goal and this requirement happen at the initial offer.
Mhm.
So that was a compromise. We'll figure that out.
If you.
By the initial offering, you mean the
Yeah.
first.
The first
developer.
occupants
Yes.
will be.
Because it's also on the rental side, it's like, so even in the municipalities that regulate rentals, which is is very few, they regulate the unit, not like the leaseholder, right? It's not the tenant. And so that's also like, just how do we do that? How does Chester do that? Like, if the initial leaseholder is this type of, family of 4 with kids enrolled in school, but then something happens and they sublet, but they still are the leaseholder and they do have a homestead filing. And then their circumstances change and there's a new leaseholder. This is sort of a requirement. By saying primary residence, you're actually sort of requiring that we follow the resident through the CHIP project. Not that we are regulating the CHIP project or sort of the transaction with the developer. That makes sense. So if you cut the end off, like for the life of the development, it becomes much more practical to be able to do that.
I just have
No,
one.
I think what I'm gonna come to you.
Yeah.
We should, I think we need to differentiate between questions for the
Oh,
witnesses.
sorry, yeah, sorry about that.
No, committee discussion. We all do it. But so go ahead if it's a question for them.
So just to distinguish, this wouldn't address the 20% or whatever figure we would say for priority of affordable housing, because that would be regulated by whoever manages the affordable housing. If it was a rental rather than at the rental level, you're not worried about that.
So a
What's
similar,
that?
So
Yeah.
Go ahead.
a similar problem. So if you approached, if the committee discussed and decided to add any other program criteria to CHIP, any. We would really interrogate it if it was in subsection 1909. Does that help you make sense? Like we would be saying, does that belong in the middle of the relationship between the municipality, which is obligated to build, own, and finance infrastructure, and the developer that is obligated to build and finance housing? And does the municipality have the existing resources and authority to enforce that under the terms of that contract between those two parties? That's really like the question. The question of like, how to best add an affordability criteria is I think a different one, but we're happy to talk about our thoughts about that too.
Yes.
So my question was actually going to lead into that. So is the committee okay if I just
Please.
completely change? How familiar are you with the Hula Ryderbyte South End Initiative District Housing Proposal?
I'm pretty familiar with it as of April 1st, 2024, when I departed the city of Burlington. Yeah, and so things that have changed since then, I wouldn't be up to date on.
I feel like you might have an
Yeah.
answer.
Okay.
Is it currently considered, earlier we had testimony on priority housing projects. Is it considered one of those projects?
It's not in a TIF district.
Okay, thank you. So earlier today, it was assumed that developers would not be willing to put an affordability aspect into their developments. I personally don't think that's true. I live obviously in Franklin County. I have a very small developer landlord who is actually looking to put in 12 units, all affordable. And that's of his own accord. He just can't because of Act 250. I went back to my notes because I remembered the Hula project saying something about mixed income. And I look back at my notes, and hopefully my notes are relatively accurate, but they have 20% affordable housing. Would you, in your conversations with municipalities, with developers, is it fair to say there are developers out there who are willing to put an aspect of affordability in there without it being prescribed in legislation?
Yeah. A real example of this project of similar scale is Cambrian Rise. Cambrian Rise is a multi-year phase development, not in a TIF district, not capturing tax increment investment. And there are 2 separate buildings there that are perpetually affordable housing, including one of the projects has a component that is for homeownership. It'll be condos. So be kind of built like an apartment building, but there would be perpetually affordable homeownership opportunity there. And there's others I could think of. I'm sure Josh can think of many more in other communities. But the reason, so Burlington has an inclusionary zoning ordinance, but it's one that you can avoid. So you can choose to build the units, or you can choose to pay basically an impact fee to the Housing Trust Fund. Okay. Developers building outside of TIF, because priority housing project was an Act 250 exemption.
Yeah.
So
I just wanted to make sure that like it wasn't prescribed to them that they had to do that. Like it sounds like they were doing it.
It was seriously incentivized through other subsidies available through the state.
Okay.
And in some cases at the local level as well. One of those you addressed earlier, which is the density bonus.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one way that projects are incented to include mixed income. Another is through tax credits, which is a sort of powerful tool that the state uses with great effect. Others are through various grants, the 500 million of ARPA money that flowed through various programs targeted at incenting both mixed income and perpetually affordable housing. And then some municipalities have their own, like Burlington is a great example with the Housing Trust Fund. Which they tax short-term rentals 9%, build the Housing Trust Fund, use that as a extra sugar on top of the funding stack for projects that are capturing other types of state subsidy. And
I would just answer in a much more simpler way that in my time in housing, affordable market rate involved, any developer that's building at scale tries hard not to limit their market. And so they build to the lowest level possible to have the most possible renters, homeowners. if you're building at a very high end and you're building a lot less, that maybe that's not your market. But in the case you don't want to build something that limits your markets, you're always incentivized to build to something that more people can afford to have more of a market to reach as just an economic principle.
So I just happened to have this tab open because I was reading this earlier. I don't want to like testify to someone else's work, but this is a paper just released by ARP yesterday, and it looks at TIF and
CHIP.
CHIP. It looks at CHIP. And so this is sort of like an example of CHIP increment inside
The
of a
capital stack, yeah.
And the capital stack includes LIHTC, which is a subsidy, and then it includes CHIP, and then it includes the developer equity.
LIHTC is low income housing tax credits, yeah.
Yeah.
So it basically, there's several size projects analyzed in this. And basically, the concept that was analyzed by Smart Growth America and ARP is that CHIP further leverages any affordable subsidy, makes it more likely that it'll be more affordable housing units brought in, and also makes it more likely that the project will pencil because the risk is less, there's a greater return. And so projects that aren't bringing in any subsidy because they're straight market rate, they have to have a higher return in order to pencil out because they're not getting grants and subsidies. When you bring CHIP in that helps pay for part of the infrastructure, it all of a sudden crosses that line where it pencils out. And so therefore they can do it. And therefore they'll want to have a bigger market to rent to or to build to. And so be stretching whatever affordability level they can reach that pencils out. So CHIP is actually a motivator, in our view, ARPs and the smart growth to build more market rate affordable units and leverage the existing affordable subsidies and stacks that are out there. But we can share this.
I was gonna say,
This
yeah.
just was what, last night released or something?
Yeah,
So-
like just last night, but this stack is for like a 4-unit project that leverages smaller direct grant subsidy. So it shows you how it works there as well.
It's using low income housing tax credits as a primary source.
This one isn't.
This one is not. This one is using,
Some small
like.
patchwork of grants.
Yeah,
These are real projects
Right.
that
Yeah.
Vermont has recently, with my understanding, is publicly accessible data.
like, for example, like we have separate from affordable housing, we have like small grants for like brownfield cleanup. Right, and like adaptive reuse projects that are available through ACCD. We have missing middle. So like we see CHIP, the CHIP increment fitting into those little stacks with like, imagine like a hoagie with like an Italian sub, and CHIP is one of them for a small project. And then for a large project that's totally perpetually affordable, that can leverage these other bigger levers, right? CHIP is another new big one for those. And so are the density bonuses that were preempted in municipal zoning.
Is, the development agreements ordinarily are recorded, right?
I don't know what you mean by recorded.
They're recordable documents. They're recorded in the clerk's office,
Oh, yeah, they're public documents.
but
they're
they
voted
run with
on.
the land.
I don't know the answer to that question. I think it depends on what's obligated under them.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Other questions? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Always.
Thanks for,
I really
I know I
support
threw it at you last
financing
minute.
of infrastructure to support housing.
We love it.
Sure you do.
We'll all join our party today from 4 to 6.
Party?
I think.
Yeah, reception. I think it's in.
Oh.
Yeah, cafeteria, 4 to 6. We'll be there.
As a passive member, I might join.
Yeah,
That's
That's the subject
you
of
can
it.
join as a passive member, you can join as a
I
lot.
don't know what.
You have scotch there?
Would we like to?
So.
Still a fair question.
The only.
Yes, sorry.
One thing I'd like to discuss is I think one suggestion on this subject, we hear from Maura Collins. Anybody else on housing?
Can I just make a comment to the committee of something that I think we have to change, and I don't think it even should be up for discussion. I just was rereading this and the report that they mentioned. I was looking towards the end and the report
It's on page what?
18,
Yeah.
line 5. And one of the committees that is missing to hearing this report is ours. So I'm going to say that needs to change, that we need to add ourselves in there. And I just wanted to say that because though I wrote myself a note and put a sticky note on it, there's a good chance I would forget. Where?
On 7.
That's the name of the Senate committee.
That's Senate.
Yep.
Senate committees on economic development, housing and general affairs. And on finance and House committees on commerce and economic development. And on ways and means. So.
Everyone who's touched it added themselves. Keep that in mind.
I'm adding us. Sorry.
One thing.
Just hold me accountable.
I think it's all right if, with the committee, if we invite Maura Collins. I don't know whether we're hearing anything from the Committee on Environment. And whether, they have any comment on the approach to tier 1, tier 2. Your chair and your vice chair have ideas. I thought that what I might do is try to read this more carefully and see if I could come up with some language that we could present. We could come up with some language to present to the committee for possibly addressing issues that have been raised by our witnesses today.
Do we, just thinking of because I think we want to get in witnesses tomorrow
Right, yeah,
morning if
yeah.
we're going to take any more. Do we want to hear from Miro just as the coalition of let's build homes?
Well, the question
This has
is,
changed quite a bit from the original.
Well, Maura
I'm-
can speak to both because she is a member.
Yes, that's true.
I don't think we need to.
I'll ask Adam Nekrasov whether, who represents them,
Perfect.
whether they have anything they need to tell us that Maura can't. I confess, I just should be clear with the committee. I spent 20 years of my life representing cities in negotiations opposite developers and development agreements. And I am puzzled about what we can do about the League of Cities position, which is they like all the goals, they just don't want to be involved in enforcing them. And I'm not sure, I don't agree that there aren't remedies. There are. I've negotiated them before. Development agreements run with the land. That is, anybody who buys land is aware of the development agreement. There's all kinds of requirements in development agreements that you want to impose that go on generationally. And the way you do it is you require the developer to record covenants that run with the land so that any landowner is aware of them and their realtor has to tell them. I'm not saying we should do this. I'm just saying it happens all the time. There's ways to enforce the kinds of questions they're asking. You get, what happens if the developer sells it? What happens if an individual then who they sells to somebody else? All these what happens, they're all addressable. I think it's a practical matter, the way this comes up. I mean, I know that most towns just don't have the people to cruise around invasively looking into who's in a building. The way it comes up is when neighbors complain Yeah, that, you know, there's a problem and the town, I think it's better if the town can't say, well, we can't do anything about it. So I think for me, the issue isn't whether there aren't remedies. We could say I would add that they have to have sufficient remedies in the contract. The other problem I have, which is the one I asked him about, is my experience is that towns like development agreements because they can put anything in them. And it's much more complicated to pass laws and ordinances than to negotiate these things in contracts. And developers like them because they're not faced with this blanket law that they walk into and it's existing. It's a two-sided negotiation. They can say, oh, we can't do that, or we can't do that, et cetera. I think also for me, it's a little alarming in that I don't know, I worry a little when you have a party saying, well, I kind of like the idea, I just don't want to have to enforce it in any way. It kind of raises the question about whether you don't have to be in fact clearer, not less clear about what you want. I'm just saying that's there. But at any rate, what I'm not sure, I am sympathetic. I'm just giving you my opinion, okay? I am sympathetic with what they're saying. That's why I asked them, if we gave you a remedy and we gave you clear authority, is that okay? And they seem to say yes. I'm not sure what
Well,
they meant yet.
You said authority, and they reiterated at the end, authority and capacity.
Right.
Which are two separate
Right,
things.
yeah. So that's right. I think I'm less worried about capacity because I just don't think it's going to come up unless somebody's, it's really noisy and complains or something like that. It's not. That's the way it comes up. It's a question of problem. And that's one of the big problems that people complain about with short-term rentals is that, the neighborhood's going to hell because all the houses are just vacationers and all that stuff. So it would be when there's developers, when there's people complaining. But I am sympathetic with it. They're saying, would you make sure if you do this that you give us more authority? And clear remedies, I guess. I can think of a lot of remedies. The simplest remedy, I'm not saying this is the one that they'd have to pick. The simplest remedy is they're negotiating opposite a developer, right? Somebody who says, I'm going to build 3 fourplexes here. And they say, well, you got to record a covenant that runs with the land that says that it's for permanent residence. End of story. That's all they have to do. And then it's there. And any realtor who sells it to people tells them what's in the covenant. It's no different than any other covenant. It just runs with the land.
It is odd though, because it runs with the land, but then it runs with the land because of the road that it goes by the house,
Right.
or it runs with the land because of the water pipe
But
that
you
comes
see,
in.
that's what puzzles me about their.
That's kind of a
See,
strange
if they said,
connection,
I know,
making a covenant with the land.
right,
And I think from their angle, which being on a select board, a lot of times we pass all this stuff. Can you just believe that your towns have their best intentions for the people in the town and give us here's what we'd like you to do and just friggin' trust us? Instead of and you need to be over their shoulder for 20 years and you need to do, it's yeah, that's exactly what we want too, right? We want these to be people who live in this town. Can you not just
I think-
micromanage how
I think that
we,
you're raising 2 issues. One is,
it's not just for this program.
right, one issue, I got it. One issue is that you're raising is it's apples and oranges. In other words, this is an infrastructure project. Why are you leveraging it on short-term rental?
Not short-term rentals, just the land in, the land, somebody's home in general.
Right. And I think that a lot of people's answer to that would be, you're talking about public money and we'll do what we want. If this is the policy, is a policy of permanent residence one that we wish to impose where, or not? I wouldn't have been surprised. In fact, one of the things that kind of surprised me about their position was their repeated assertion that they didn't have any problem with the goal. Because in fact, they testified to it previously, don't do anything statewide, leave it to each individual town what they do. So I was kind of surprised by that. I think the idea of will you just leave us alone is fine as long as towns have a history of doing it. I think what worries me is that the more these people talk, the more I feel like, well, they wouldn't. But it's a practical matter in Vermont. As a practical matter, I don't think this would ever come up until residents complain. And then the question is, does the town have any tools?
For enforcement.
For enforcement, yeah. And then they get to the point of, oh my God, we don't have any tools for enforcement. We just don't have the people to enforce it. Having been on a select board that tried to enforce an ordinance against wandering livestock. Oh my God, this is never a bit. I have some sympathy. Anyway, okay.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Sonia's had her hands up.
Claudia? No.
So with this issue of like, okay, so they've built whatever it is, they've extended the water and built the road using the infrastructure fund. And they built these units and they are now owned by somebody.
Yeah, right.
What happened, and let's say those units have the covenant. Are you saying, when you say that the covenant runs with the land, do you mean every unit built along that sewer or water system or along that road will have to follow the
What I
covenant?
mean, no, that's not what I mean by run with the land. I'm sorry. Run with the land means just no matter who owns it over the
The
years.
units,
The unit.
the units that
No.
were built initially
Right,
when
but
the infrastructure was.
Once you record a covenant on land, it's perpetual. It doesn't matter who owns it. It doesn't matter.
No, what I'm
happens.
asking is it the original 5 units that were built by the developer that developed the infrastructure? Or could it be additional units
it's
that are
just-
added after, which is part of our goal is to be able to.
It's the development. You have to define the development.
You have to define the development.
Right at the beginning, you had to
You
define.
get what I'm saying?
Yeah, it would just be the 5 units.
Okay,
I mean, it would be anything where you
That
use
developer
you
built.
use
That use the chip.
device for doing it.
yeah.
And if, let's say, for example, somebody extends the sewer, builds 4 units, and then the next development doesn't need any subsidy, just connects.
Yeah.
Then it wouldn't apply.
That's what I'm asking, yeah.
So. Well, I think we should all move, this was an
Just
interesting
another
day.
simple bill.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
right.
think we should all noodle on it, and. Well. Tomorrow, you think we can get, yeah, okay. Is there anyone else that occurs to anybody in terms of testimony? Everybody should take some time. And in fact, if we don't have witnesses and we're together here, I think I'll allow some time for just reading, read it and discuss it as we go so we can absorb it. It's one thing to heard about it all day. It's another if you can sit and read it. And if you don't want to take it home and read it tonight, we'll read it during the committee. Okay, yeah.
I have a simple question. Why would a town, a municipality, not be interested in having any kind of TIF?
Because not every town or municipality is eligible for a tip.
That some are ineligible. And if they're, like, for example, in tier 2, they don't have a permit, et cetera.
And we set a maximum number of TIFs. for the state.
Oh, now, you mean the TIF now?
Yeah,
Oh, they're highly regulated. There are only so many you can have.
Yeah, and so like if you.
They're skewed towards bigger towns.
Yeah.
so what if it's a big
Yeah.
town?
Downtowns.
If there's already two TIFs within one TIF or within a county, you can't do it. Like there's
Right.
so overly regulated
Right.
that it makes it at this point almost impossible. So the HUA that falls with that outside of the district. Or that's my understanding, correct? It's not a TIF district currently.
My feeling is that TIFs don't belong in, I know this is gonna be a hot take, but that TIFs don't belong in the ed fund, but CHIPs do.
Just because TIFs are bigger, more centrally, why?
Because they don't, I mean, they build, they contribute to the building of some housing, but they don't. It's more, to me, it's more commerce than it is housing, and therefore it does not belong in the ed fund.
And so.
But the chip does, because it is directly related to housing.
For the commerce.
That's my hot take.
Bringing in a lot of kids.
Good thing we're talking about CHIP and not TIF.
Well,
I've been involved, I mean, I can't comment on tax increment financing here. I've been involved in a lot of tax increment financing. I helped negotiate the deal for the ballpark in San Francisco, and it was dependent on tax increment financing in part. And the ballpark stimulated the development of an entire neighborhood of San Francisco.
Oh, that's like the stadium in Brooklyn. I mean, boy.
Yeah, it's just, it's, the problem is,
City.
I don't want to get into it. I mean, there have been abuses of tax increment financing. There have been times when tax increment financing was used to eliminate a lot of housing.
And we're also, all the examples that you and I just gave are in big cities, of which we have zero.
Right.
So.
Chestnut got over 3,000 people.
That's a big one.
That's 100 less than when I was a.
Burlington.
Elizabeth and I had testimony on the basic
The BNB.
budget where no part of Vermont is considered urban in like the actual definition of urban.
Yeah.
Which is
That's
kind of
true.
funny,
Right.
as we
Well,
were talking about.
Burlington is a small town in
Yeah.
most places, yeah.
So like that wouldn't even be, it's considered rural and the rest of it.
But I think, well, I'm just thinking just to list some areas that we could work on. One is, I don't know what we're gonna get from the Environment Committee, if anything. But there's a solution that's in here. It's not like they didn't think about it. There's a solution that's in here to the problem of tier 1, tier 2. Right? It's in here now. And I think with some work, it could be loosened up a bit in a way that makes sense. And I commit to work with my co-chair and bring back to you some possible approaches that we could work with. You heard some of it discussed today. I tend to think that areas that are not in, that are in tier 2 and not in tier 1, but would be in tier 1 if they had only had the infrastructure, which is the subject of the thing, they should be allowed to move ahead without getting an Act 250 permit or something like that. I think we heard a lot of testimony about tightening up somewhat, or sort of perhaps tightening up the affordable housing provision a bit and maybe defining what we mean when we say it. I don't think there's my own view is there's not a problem defining what we mean. The question is what we do with the definition. And that's something we have to think about. I mean, I think it always helps to be clear, but so what we want to do is work our way towards compromises on these issues that we are comfortable with. If any. And if anybody has any ideas along these lines, please write them down or be prepared to talk about them. Okay? Anything else? Tomorrow, our day begins at 9 a.m.
And Laura Collins will be here from 9 to 9:30.
Okay, and then,
Yes.
yeah. And I think then we're gonna have committee discussion after her. And we'll see if there's more coming in, more incoming. Okay? Take it from there.
Why does it say, it says, I just get.
In other words.
Just, I invited her like 10 minutes ago, and she just now accepted.
And did you?
I did hit
you
refresh.
put her in there?
No, I'm hitting refresh.
Because it's not on there because she just, yeah.
Oh.
So.
She's not saying she just,
Okay.
she's not saying she just